Well, good afternoon. My name is Katrina Ingram, and I was told that we should be a little bit provocative in these workshops. And so this is a data workshop, but the title is Your Doorbell Racist? And I'm going to be talking about encoded bias in AI-enabled technology. We are going to be covering data. We're going to be covering a lot of things in the next 45 minutes. So I'm hoping to have a little bit of time at the end for questions, but if we do run out of time, I would encourage you to reach out to me. Definitely send me an email. I love to answer questions and have a dialogue with you, but I do have a lot of information that I want to share with you today. But before we get into all of that, I want to tell you a little bit about my own personal story into this work. I'm really excited to be here today talking with you because, like you, I am a professional communicator. I spent the bulk of my career in marketing and communication roles and a lot of time in media. So I was at the CBC for a little bit, but I spent many years at this place, CKUA Radio here in Edmonton. And I was at CKUA for about a decade. And it was in 2017 that I decided I love media, I love radio, but I want to try a couple of new things. And I wasn't sure where I wanted to go in terms of my career. And that led me on a path back to school to do a master's in communications and technology at the University of Alberta. And in undertaking that journey, I serendipitously landed in the world of artificial intelligence and ethics. And so I am not a technical person. I did not learn how to do machine learning, but I learned a lot about it in terms of what it meant for society. I learned a lot about the ethical considerations around artificial intelligence and the use of data. And that's really the crux of what I want to talk with you about today. To start out with, I'll just kind of touch on the things I hope to cover in this session. So I want to talk about the ethical issues in AI, the role of data. We're going to do a super quick tour of the history of AI. I think it's really important to understand kind of the backstory on this, if you will. And we'll also talk very briefly about what exactly is AI anyways. Then we'll have a discussion about how bias kind of gets encoded into these technologies and some examples of that. And finally, we'll end on what I hope to be a more positive note, which is how do we address these issues? What can we do as communicators in particular? So that's really what I want to cover with you today. But let's talk a bit about the headlines. Now, as professional communicators, I'm sure that you're up on some of what's going on in terms of the biases that can happen when it comes to artificial intelligence. You may have seen some of these scary headlines. Everything from monopolies that are happening when it comes to our data, such as Google kind of taking over our health record systems. And some of the things that are happening with deep fakes and misinformation, disinformation, and the role that AI and data play in all of that. I want to share a personal story. This happened to me just a month ago, and I'm consulting on an anti-Black racism podcast. And I wanted to throw up a very quick website to show my client just how we could display some of the information. And so I went to Weebly. They have a site where you can kind of build a free website very quickly. And so I went in there and I threw up some information. I was looking in the photo editor. I wanted a nice photograph. I wanted some Black people having a conversation just to put on this website. And so I searched for the term Black people. And I was using the photo editor, which is attached to Flickr. And it came up with all these horribly racist images, not even of people, but of just awful sayings and bad things. And I was just, on the one hand, as a researcher, I knew exactly what was going on. And I'm going to talk to you more about how this bias gets encoded into a data set. As a person, I was just, horrified and just kind of alarmed by what happened. And so it just sort of, hit me very deeply in that moment. And this is just literally a month ago. And so it's a fresh example. But let me dig into what exactly was going on in terms of this racist search. Before I get to that, though, let me talk a bit about another example. Joy Bualam-Winley is an AI researcher. And she did a landmark study called Gender Shades. And what was happening for Joy is that she was working on a degree, a master's degree at MIT, and she found that the facial recognition software that she was using for her project, it wasn't recognizing her face. And so she wound up having to code her project wearing a white mask. And what she demonstrated through her work is that the facial recognition technologies do not work well for all people. And in fact, women of color in particular were a segment where these technologies didn't work very well at all. And so there's a movie that was made about this called Coded Bias. It's excellent. It really goes into her story in a lot more detail and the landmark study that she did. So these are some of the issues that we find with respect to technology and how it can lead to ethical concerns, human rights issues. So we see things like privacy kind of weighing into the equation as we're collecting and using all of the data that's needed to power an AI system. We're seeing things like human rights challenges, whether things are accountable, whether they're transparent, there's issues of justice and equity. All of these kind of things are coming to bear when we look at what's going on with some of these systems. And when I think about this in the context of our work as communicators, reputational risk is one of the obvious things that comes up. And later on, I'm going to talk a bit more about this, but I just kind of wanted to flag that for you as we're having this discussion. So these are some foundational texts and go-to resources that I found very helpful in the course of my work. And I think that they really sum up nicely what's happening and the fact that technology is not neutral. And the first time I heard that statement, one of the first times was listening to Sophia Noble. She actually came to Edmonton in February of 2019 and did a talk about her book, Algorithms of Oppression. And what she talked about was exactly what happened to me with that Weebly search. So I was searching for a term, and what came back was a lot of racial and racist kind of encoded data. And this is what happened to Sophia Noble when she was doing her work for her book many, many years ago. She discovered that these search engines are not actually neutral or objective. And the first time I heard that, it was a little shocking because I thought, well, these technologies must be objective. They're computers. I mean, that's, you know, how could they have racism baked into them? But the reality is that they do. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about how that happens. The other book that, and person who I feel very aligned with in terms of her work is Ruha Benjamin, and she's a sociologist from Princeton and has written an excellent book called Race After Technology. And she has lots of great examples about how this happens and kind of the taking more of a sociological approach, as you might imagine, and kind of like looking at the systems that create these results. And so anyways, I wanted to share these resources as two foundational texts that have really informed a lot of my work. So in terms of my own work and how I think about and frame these issues and where we find ethical issues in the development of AI, I like to think about it in terms of three buckets: data, math, and people. And when I think about these, I think about concentric circles. And I kind of start in the middle with data because it's pretty concrete and we can kind of think about how data gets encoded with biases, how the history of how data was collected or who we paid attention to collect data from kind of leads us to have, you know, maybe a lot of data on one group and maybe not so much data on another group. So we have over or under representation that can kind of be in our data set. And so data kind of setting the ground truth or being what the systems use to learn from is a really important piece of the equation, but it's not the whole story. Kind of wrapped onto data, and the next concentric circle is math. And it might seem controversial to say math is not neutral. We think of, you know, 2 + 2, it's 4. How is this, you know, not objective? But what I mean by this is the computational models, the computational mathematical models that are used to construct AI systems have a lot of decision making that go into them. And these decisions are made by people. And so there's a thing called feature engineering, whereby you can dial up the volume on certain things, dial down the volume on other things. You get to make all these judgment calls of how you're going to weight things. And all of that has biases baked into it because it involves decisions made by people. And so this next concentric circle is actually the people. And when you think about the people who make AI systems, first of all, it's not a very diverse group of people. It's mostly men of a certain kind of background, socioeconomic status, PhDs, highly educated, and they're mostly white or Asian. Only 2% of Google's workforce is Black. Only 16 to 18% of AI researchers are women. So right away, we have a very homogenous and elite group of people who are making a lot of these decisions. So we layer that into a bigger socio-technical system in terms of how these decisions are being made. And what I mean by that is something like funding, for example. So how do we decide that something is worthwhile in terms of a problem worth putting resources behind? Somebody makes that decision. And right now, there are a handful of companies who are kind of leading the charge when it comes to AI on a global scale. They're the players that you would normally think about, the big players in the space. And they're making a lot of decisions about what kind of technologies come to light versus what don't. And so there's a lot of decisions being made, again, that have to do more with politics and economics and other things, not just the technology itself. And that's what I mean by the people layer. So those are some of the areas that I believe we find, ethical issues throughout the system. I want to do a bit of a deep dive into data. This is the data workshop, and I think it's really important to talk about what exactly is data, how does it get collected, and how does it get used in these systems. And so data itself is abstracted representations. And what we're trying to do, think about what you're trying to do whenever you collect data. You're probably trying to measure some kind of phenomenon. You're probably trying to put some things into categories or groupings. We can think about this when we create a survey, for example. We're trying to measure, we're trying to categorize. And so that's really kind of the crux of why we're collecting data in the first place. But data is, it doesn't exist sort of independently of all of these other systems. And that's why this term counting as political really resonated with me. And I think we really saw this clearly in terms of COVID. I remember in the early days of COVID, there were many countries that were saying, we don't have any COVID here. And what they meant by that is they just had decided they weren't going to count the various cases of COVID. And so there's political reasons for that, of course. But you can kind of see how politics sort of plays into what gets counted or how things get counted. And that to me was sort of a very recent example of how this can play out. Then when we think about data, as much as we're collecting a lot of data, sometimes we don't have complete data. We don't have the exact data that we want or need. And so we're making decisions based off of incomplete data. Sometimes data is siloed, it's hard to get at. So maybe we just go for the data that's easier to get at. It's already in a machine readable format. It's not stuck in a bunch of file boxes in the basement that we need to make into something digital. And that's what I mean by siloed data. Data gets stuck in different systems, even different computer systems that don't interact with each other. And all of that can lead to biases in how we kind of approach using data, and also biases in what data was collected in the first place. I'm reading a really good book right now called Invisible Women. It talks about how women have been excluded from some of these important data-driven decisions because the data wasn't there from the women's perspective. And so it just illuminates this issue from a gender perspective. And it's definitely there too when it comes to issues of race. There's also this secondary uses of data, and there's a couple of different aspects to this. I like to think of this as cut and paste. So this idea that we'll use something and reuse something. We collect data for one purpose and then we use it for a different purpose. This is happening all around us all the time. One example is Twitter. So we have Twitter accounts, we're tweeting for one purpose. We're not necessarily thinking that a researcher is going to come and analyze that information and use that information to maybe, I don't know, assess the state of our mental health, doing sentiment analysis on Twitter, for example. That kind of thing is happening. And part of why Twitter is appealing is it's really easy, it's very available, it's kind of public, you don't really need to get consent per se to use it. And so it kind of becomes this go-to data set that a lot of researchers will gravitate towards because it's availability. So it's kind of an availability bias. And that leads to issues around privacy and consent. So when we think about privacy and consent, you know, those terms of service agreements that we all look at and just kind of click through and nobody really reads, those aren't really consent in the strongest form of the word. You know, having two parties who understand and enter into a transaction kind of on equal terms, that's not happening when it comes to digital data. In fact, you know, we don't, in some cases, really have a choice. You know, I guess the choice could be not to use the service. But that doesn't feel like a really legitimate choice in a world where some of these services are you know, table stakes for just being living in the 21st century. And so I think that really needs to be examined. There's also issues with anonymization as well, and inadequate protections around anonymizing a data set. So PII, personal identifying information, is something that we talk a lot about in data, and that's things like our name or other pieces of information that identify us. And there's a sense that if we strip a data set of PII, we can't really necessarily, we've anonymized it, we can't really identify that person. But let's say data set A has no PII and data set B has no PII, but you merge these things together and all of a sudden you're starting to get opportunity to re-identify people. And it's as simple sometimes as triangulating like 3 different data sets to kind of re-identify someone. There's a famous story of a researcher named LaTanya Sweeney who re-identified the governor of Massachusetts, and she mailed him his health record as a result. So that's something that could happen, and kind of challenges this notion of privacy. And all of this is sort of sitting in this bigger system, this system called surveillance capitalism. Now, Shoshana Zuboff, she's a researcher and a professor emeritus from Harvard. She wrote a book called The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, and it's an excellent kind of foundational text for this work. And she talks about how this is the new way of doing business. This is the new business model of kind of hoovering up all this data, mashing it up in new ways, asking it different questions. We can store all this data because it's cheap to do so. We put it in the cloud. We use it later. We're not really sure what we're going to use it for, but it's going to be good for something. We're sure of that. And so we kind of get into this world where, you know, whoever has the most data to feed these AI systems can actually gain an advantage economically. And we see that as the business model of big companies like Google and Facebook. So kind of related to all of this is also data labeling. So when we think about how AI systems learn from data, they don't have any other context of the world like we do. They only learn from their one data set. And so how the data is labeled becomes incredibly important. And so if there are biases baked into the labeling of data, which is what I think was happening with that Weebly data set that I was drawing all those racist images for, I think there was a labeling issue at play there, then it can lead to bad outcomes and results. Part of that data labeling story also has to do with the gig economy and how we kind of farm out that work. It's not very appealing work, as one might imagine. It's kind of tedious work, and we farm it out to the lowest, you know, common denominator and people who don't make very much money are kind of part of that world and doing that work. And the reality is that these AI systems are very hungry. They need millions of training examples, the more the better. So they really kind of feed on and revolve around data. Data becomes a very important, you know, they call it the new oil. Data is the new oil for these systems. So that's a little bit of a context around data. And the last thing I want to say about data is increasingly what we're seeing is that this whole chain of data gathering and data and analysis is automated. So we have sensors in things like our Fitbits and our phones and our computers, and it's kind of gathering all of these things, data that you don't even think is data. We call it metadata, data about data. So, you know, on your phone, that might be like your GPS location, for example. So it has nothing to do with the content, let's say, that you're putting into a social media system, but it might be like locating like where you're at physically, where you're located while you're doing that. So these kind of pieces start to feed together and kind of build out these enormous data sets that then get analyzed by AI systems. So I think this is just, we're at the tip of the iceberg here. And as we move into the Internet of Things and smart enable everything, we're going to see more of this. So I want to talk a bit, that's what's going on. How did we get here? What brought us to this moment? I think it's really important to look at the history of how things develop. I'm going to do this in one slide. This is going to be the super quick history of AI in North America in one slide talk. And so here we go. So I want to take us back to the 1950s. Computer science is a new field, and AI is kind of a newer field within computer science, and it's sort of emerging from this academic military industrial complex. So at the time, the military was very fundamental in funding a lot of the technologies in their early days, computers and so forth, and AI becomes part of this. And AI is actually defined as a term by a group of highly educated white men. They go to a conference in Dartmouth, they come out, and the term AI is coined by John McCarthy. And I think it's always interesting to look at who was in the room and who's not in the room, so to speak. And so when I think about who's not in the room, women and people of color were not in the room. And I think the history of women as it relates to computing science is incredibly interesting. If anyone's seen the film Hidden Figures, this was about a group of women who were known as computers. So these women were called computers because they were mathematicians doing computations by hand to help NASA launch rockets. And so in the early days, women were kind of doing all this software type work. Software wasn't seen as men's work. Men were building hardware. That was the real, where they thought the real brain power needed to reside. But then as kind of things transpired and people realized that how important software was, women kind of got pushed out of the equation when it came to software. And that whole piece of history of computer science, I think this gender piece, I think is really quite interesting. Then there was BIPOC communities who were excluded from the conversation. And in particular, there was this one civil rights activist named Roy Wilkins, and he wrote an article in 1967 called "Computerize the Race Problem?" ? And so he was kind of asking whether this new technology of computers might be beneficial in trying to, help address some of the issues that were being fought for during the civil rights movement, and maybe there was a place for this technology in that and solving these problems. And of course, he was actively excluded from the conversation along with BIPOC communities. And reflecting back on this, Professor Charles McElwain, who is with NYU, he wrote a book about this, and just kind of reflected, what might have happened or been done differently if perhaps communities of color had been at the table in the early days. How might things have been reshaped in a different way? So that's an interesting question. And so then what happens after kind of the early days is we see AI going through these cycles, and I call it the overpromise, underdeliver, cycle. So we see like AI is going to solve everything, and then we go through winter and everybody's disappointed by the results, and then we kind of go through the hype cycle again, and then everybody's disappointed with the results. And to be fair, there were some interesting things happening, some really exciting breakthroughs that were taking place in AI during this time. And a lot of them relate to the work that was being done in games. And the University of Alberta, where I'm attached to, was instrumental in a lot of this work. And so when it comes to solving for checkers, chess, and later poker, there are U of A connections to all of this work. And that work was also really foundational, not just, in the context of a game, but it was sort of like games as a proving ground for some of these bigger concepts that are now taken out and used in other applied contexts for AI. So that work was really fundamental. And then at the same time, we have this rise of surveillance capitalism. So this is what Zuboff was talking about and what I talked about earlier. This is kind of marching along in the background over the context of, at least the last 20 or so years with Google in particular, kind of like pushing the boundaries of this. So all of that was going on. Then in 2012, we have a breakthrough, and it's on the computational side. We get these things called GPUs, and they're really fast computers. And essentially now we've got lots of data, we've got this, processing power, and then we have these algorithms that we've been developing through AI research for the past 40 years or so. We put them all together, And now we can actually do some of the things that we wanted to do in AI, that they wanted to do in AI back in the 80s and 90s and so forth. And so AI now becomes the darling of tech and VCs. Everything is sort of AI enabled. It's kind of almost a bit of a marketing term in a lot of cases. And so we're kind of living through this revolution. But then around 2016, we also start seeing what I would call the dark side of all of this. So we have Snowden kind of coming out with the movie Snowden comes out in 2016 and popularizes what happened with when the government kind of knows everything and is surveilling everything. We have Cambridge Analytica and the scandal there, and we saw what happened when social media and politics intersect. And now we're kind of living through other examples, as I've shared with you, about maybe the downside of some of this technology and how we need to take some care. So I just want to talk very quickly and give you a really non-technical definition of what is AI. We've been throwing this term around, but we haven't really defined it yet. When I talk to people kind of on the street about what is AI, they have these images of the Terminator or Skynet or something like that. So we're not, that is not really, that's great dystopian Hollywood movie fare, but it's not really what we're talking about. What we're talking about is narrow AI, or AI that is very good at maybe doing one specific task. And it's essentially, machine-based systems that are able to have a goal that they can advance with, some level of autonomy in order to make predictions, recommendations, and so forth. So this is kind of one definition of AI. There are other definitions. I like this one from the OECD. I wanted to show you this slide too, because sometimes we equate AI with machine learning. And I wanted to just say that machine learning is a specific technique or way of doing AI that involves using a lot of data. I've heard it described as like flashcard-based learning. So you kind of feed the AI lots of data and it kind of learns all these patterns, and there's probabilities and statistics kind of layered into that. And then deep learning or deep neural nets is a very specific type of machine learning. But the reason I wanted to show you this is not necessarily for all those technical definitions, but to say that the field of AI is bigger than machine learning. And so while machine learning is kind of the darling of AI in terms of how we do things right now, it may not always be that way. And I just wanted to kind of put that out there and say there may be other ways of approaching this topic, but this is kind of where we're focused at the moment. So moving on from technology, because this is not just about technology, really what I think this is about is people and power. And this is Timnit Gebru. She was the co-lead of the AI ethics group at Google up until December of last year, when she was fired for speaking out about some practices that she saw at Google that were giving her pause and cause for concern. And since then, this story has kind of blown up in a lot of different ways. And since then, another woman, Margaret Mitchell, who was the other co-lead of the AI ethics group, has also been let go from Google. And this story kind of rocked the AI ethics community because Timnit Gebru, is an absolute rock star. Her credentials are impeccable. And yet she was, let go in this very public way. And so I think there's a sense of, as we try and speak out and speak up about these issues, there are real repercussions taking place for people, even people who have, a certain amount of power in terms of their own position and credentials. And so this was actually quite, it really shook the core of my community, the AI ethics community, when all of this happened. And it's still kind of an ongoing situation right now. And that leads me to this idea of agenda setting. And I think agenda setting is something that as communicators we're very aware of, and we understand really well this kind of idea of who gets to sort of state a narrative or shape something in a particular direction. And I think about whoever defines the problem gets to set the agenda when it comes to technology. And so with BIPOC communities, in the early days, they became the targets of this technology. I talked about Roy Wilkins and the civil rights movement. Well, a lot of that, technology was kind of turned on a group of people to police them. And so it's never, necessarily framed in really blatant terms like that. It's framed as having a societal problem like lowering crime rates, keeping people safe. I mean, those are good things, right? We want to keep people safe. We want to lower crime rates. So let's use this technology for those things. That's how it gets framed. I want to share this clip with you from the excellent TV series, The Wire. And to me, this just kind of exemplifies how a power dynamic kind of gets shaped and a technology, in this case, the CompStat program, which is kind of a precursor to some of the policing systems that are used now. It kind of became this defining program that was sort of pushed through by the people who are in charge in managing to the metrics. So I apologize for the salty language, but I just want to share with you this clip. Here we go.
District by district will decline by 5% before the end of the year.
We are dealing in will reduce the UCR felonies by 5% or more, or, and I've always wanted to say this, let no man come back alive.
In addition, we will hold this year's murders to 275 or less.
Christ.
Feeling a little phased, Colonel Forster? A little dyspeptic?
This who? No, sir. I'm good to go.
Here's a fun fact for you people. If Baltimore had New York's population, we'd be clocking 4,000 murders a year at this rate. There is no excuse I will accept. I don't care how you do it. Just fucking do it.
Deputy, as familiar as we all are with the urban crime environment, I think we all understand there are certain processes by which you can reduce the number of overall felonies. You can reclassify an ag assault, or you can unfound a robbery, but how do you make a body disappear?
There isn't one of you in this room who isn't here by appointment. If you want to continue wearing those oak clusters, you will shut up and step up. Any of you who can't bring in the numbers we need will be replaced by someone who can.
That is all.
That is all. I think that kind of says it all. So moving on from CompStat, I want to now talk about Compass, which is an AI program that received a lot of publicity a couple of years ago because it was the subject of an investigation by a news organization in the US called ProPublica. And what Compass does is it's a recidivism program. So it basically scores people and decides whether they're going to get parole, what are the terms of their parole, and so forth. And when ProPublica did their investigation, they found that Black people were receiving harsher scores than white people. And this was preventing them from being paroled at an equitable rate. And so basically, it was discriminating against Black people. And so they did this analysis, and it became quite controversial in the ensuing years because there were counter analyses that were done by other researchers. And these other researchers were saying that they didn't agree with methodologies and that they weren't measuring the right things in the ProPublica analysis. And so what I saw was, two groups of people kind of talking past each other on this issue. And it's very difficult to take a concept like fairness, like what is fairness? And how do we kind of encode that into a AI system? And what I saw in reading the two different sets of research is that each group had a different way of defining what is fair. And that led to kind of different results and different analysis of this particular topic. So I guess I just wanted to kind of present that in the context of the ProPublica case in terms of shedding a light on the bias that was kind of encoded in the system, but B, some of the pushback that can happen when different groups of people decide to take a different lens on a particular topic. So that's the story of Compass. I want to get to your doorbell, though, because I promised you we're going to talk about this. It wasn't just a catchy headline. What I'm seeing now is that surveillance capitalism has really come home in the sense that we are all, being, I guess, asked to take part in this in varying ways. And this is one. So the Ring doorbell, which is within the PowerPoint. Anyways, okay, so that is a lot about what's going on, contextualizing it in terms of the history of AI. But I want to talk about where we're going. Like, what do we do with all of this? What can we do? How can we reshape this in a positive and more effective way? What do we do now? So I find that sometimes it helps to think about these things in terms of a business perspective. And I like to think that all companies would just want to step up and do the right thing and fix things. But sometimes I think they need help to sort of see it in the context of why this is good for their business or for their organization. And I've highlighted this issue of reputation management because I think as communicators, this is a large, component, let's say, of what we're tasked to do in terms of ensuring that our companies are, positioned well and are doing, being seen to be doing good things as well as doing good things. But also how this issue of reputational management connects to so many other things. So it can connect to legal risk and compliance. So if, for example, we're seeing headlines about our organization and how it's done things in ways that are less than ethical, that might lead to lawsuits, that might lead to fines from regulators, that then leads to financial risk. So you can see all of these things are actually connected, even as I've separated them out into separate categories of business issues and ethical issues. They're interwoven. So I think it's important to kind of look at that business perspective. This is from a Capgemini report, and it talks about the consumer perspective. So what are customers expecting? Well, they're expecting things to be clearly explainable. They're expecting that companies will take ownership if there is an issue with an AI system. They're expecting that models are going to be fair and free from prejudice and bias. And this is consistent across all kinds of different sectors. So basically, consumers are expecting companies to do good things when it comes to using AI and to act in ways that are fair and transparent. I also think about stakeholders a lot, and this kind of goes back to my comment about the fact that this field is not very diverse. The people making the technology are a pretty homogenous group. And so more than ever, I feel it's very, very important that we have stakeholders coming to the table, even as we're thinking about what the issues are that we're trying to solve with a particular technology, and having a voice and being part of the conversation. And as a communicator, I think a lot about, who has power in a relationship, and the stakeholder saliency model to me just, sums up a lot of this. And so I think it's really incumbent upon us as communicators to try and bring more voices to the table, to be part of the conversation in the early days, but all the way through the process. So I think that's a critical piece of work. So in general, when I think about next steps, I think about education, and I think about that throughout the entire spectrum of people involved in this process, from those who are building the AI systems to really kind of understand in a greater way some of the ethical issues, but also those who are in governance roles within organizations. I think there's a large role to play for, say, boards of directors or management teams to really kind of understand the risks that are inherent in these systems. I think about roles like AI ethics officers, having committees who are looking at algorithmic risk. The data protection officer role is actually one that's enshrined in some regulation. So all of those roles are important. And I think they also link to a lot of the EDI roles and work that we're also trying to advance, and that places like this conference are shedding a light on. I think these two issues are very connected. And I see lots of opportunity for these groups of people to work together on this. And that kind of leads to this bigger, point around changing who makes AI. I think that this is, again, like a longer term play. I don't think these things change overnight, but really trying to ensure that we have greater diversity in terms of who's actually making the technology, and also making sure we have stakeholders coming to the table to be part of the conversation in terms of what technologies get made and how they get used. Regulation, I think, is also an important piece of this equation. And the GDPR, which is a general data protection regulation coming out of Europe, is kind of the Cadillac benchmark on a global scale. And it's kind of setting that standard across the world. And a lot of other countries are looking to the GDPR in terms of trying to intersect and be compliant with that level of regulation. It's still early days for the GDPR, so we're going to see how that all rolls out in a practical sense. I also feel that there's a role to audit AI systems and to have third-party audits, sort of like what we have for financial systems. When it comes to publicly traded companies, they have to have pass audits. I think I could see a day for AI systems to kind of be in that same area. And then also certification of these systems so that consumers can make good choices and really understand, what the issues are and what's trustworthy and what is perhaps questionable. So for me, this work is very personal, and this is, something where I, again, see sort of the EDI and the AI intersecting. I want to play a piece of audio that I wrote. I wrote this right after George Floyd's murder, when I was completely, heartbroken and horrified and despondent about everything that was going on. And I wrote it about last February 2020. I was on my way to an AI conference, AI and ethics conference in New York. And this is what happened to me on the way to that conference.
Like so many people, I've spent a lot of time these past several weeks horrified and heartbroken at the state of the world. People are rising up to demand that we address the inequalities and racism that have hurt Black, Indigenous, and people of color for a very long time. It's led to a lot of reflection about my experiences with racism and how I want to move forward. I'm of mixed race. Most people would say I am Asian, though they have a harder time placing me in a category. I've been fortunate not to have been subjected to racial violence, and so far managed to avoid the most egregious acts of overt racism that many people face. Yet 1,000 microaggressions, systemic discrimination, a sense of not being welcome, being marginalized and made to feel inferior or invisible are all part of my lived experience. These are issues I've confronted throughout my life. Microaggressions are specific incidents whereby a bias or stereotype towards a marginalized group is expressed in ways that are insulting or offensive. They are casual and frequent, often not intended to cause harm. Thus, the person experiencing a microaggression will often find themselves wondering if they are being oversensitive or even paranoid. Though small, these encounters are hurtful, and over time, it's like it's experiencing many tiny cuts that add up to deep wounds. On my way to New York City earlier this year, as part of the coronavirus screening protocol, I was asked rather aggressively by a U.S. Border Patrol agent, "When was the last time you were in China?" Let me see, I thought. How about never? Is never an option? Of course, I didn't say that out loud because that would just end badly for me. The question could easily have been framed as, have you been traveling to or from China recently? Which I'm fairly certain is what a non-Asian looking person would have been asked. In fact, this is how it got reframed when I responded, "Excuse me?" Of course, I also replayed this incident over and over. Am I being too sensitive? Why am I being asked this question in this way? What did they really mean? I should just like so many people, I was wondering what they really mean. I should just let this go. But wait a minute. Such is the nature of microaggressions.
So as I wrap up the presentation today, I want to leave you with some resources. I've been writing and blogging about these issues since fall of 2019. You can find more of my work at ethicallyalignedai.com. I also have a podcast that I launched with the University of Alberta. It's not just about AI ethics, but it's about all of the really interesting work that's taking place in AI at the U of A, and it's called AI for Society Dialogues. And if you Google that, you'll find that podcast. We've got a number of episodes that have already launched, and there's more to come. I also have a podcast. This isn't about AI, but it's about going back to school as a midlife person. And given that many of our sponsors today are universities, I thought I would share that as well. And if you're at all curious about what it's like to go back and do a master's degree after being out of school for over 2 decades, this is a podcast for you. So that's at backtoschoolagain.ca. And I have a new podcast, which I alluded to earlier, called Black Talk, which is launching in May. And this is a podcast about anti-Black racism and Black achievement. I'm the lead producer on this, and I'm really excited to be working with such a fantastic team of people to bring this to light. And a connection to this conference, your closing keynote today, Selena Cesar Chavanez. She is one of our guests on this particular podcast. So she's a fantastic person and speaker. I know you're going to enjoy hearing from her later today. If you want to connect with me, this is where you can reach me. As I said earlier, I love to hear from you. If you have any questions about the work that I'm doing, you want to have a conversation about any of this, please reach out. You can also find me on LinkedIn. And this is how I'm ending all of my presentations these days. Because for me, gin is a foundational value of my company. It's how I want to show up in the world. And I just wanted to say thank you so much for being here and for letting me share some of my work and just for taking part in this workshop. Enjoy the rest of your conference. Thank you.